you mind if I just go ahead and start?
Okay. You'll have to tell me when we have participation. Let me see here.
We have some folks coming in. Welcome, everyone. We're going to begin in just one moment. Give some folks some time to come into the room. Just so everyone is aware, we are recording this tonight. And this is a conversation on civil discourse. And Dr. Bedford has asked that there is going to be some participation if you'd like, but she'll go over that soon. And if you have any questions, you can always put it in the chat in the Q&A section. All right, 6:01, I'm going to go ahead and do some opening remarks. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Britton Ellis, and I'm the Civic Librarian at Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. I'd like to welcome you all to our program, The Importance of Civil Discourse. This program is being recorded and will be shared with all registered attendees, as well as uploaded onto our Civic CLP YouTube playlist. As you listen to the presentation, you are encouraged to share questions in the Zoom chat box in the Q&A found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer those questions with the time allotted at the end. And I do want to mention that from time to time, we do experience some technical glitches. And so please feel free to reach out to us via chat, and we'll try to troubleshoot as best we can. And if you feel like we might be experiencing some glitches, you can always let us know too. I also want to bring up some community agreements which have been written for this virtual event. So by participating today through Q&A and in the comments, you are agreeing to the following. Keep it relevant. This discussion is focused on fundamentals of debate and learning how to explain your ideas and access different viewpoints from school and professional settings during political discussion and through written publication. So please do your best to tailor your comments and questions to the topics at hand. Keep it kind. Treat everyone in this virtual space with respect. Keep it positive. Opinions will vary and all opinions are valid. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Georgia Bedford. Dr. Bedford is a full-time faculty member in the Department of Communication at the University of Pittsburgh and acting associate director of the William Pitt Debating Union, also known as WPDU. As a co-curricular program, WPDU works with students, faculty, and leadership to convene public debates and perform outreach activities to address salient and pressing topics confronting local, regional, and national communities. The union regularly collaborates with universities throughout the Pittsburgh area to host domestic debates, as well as foreign national teams as they tour the United States. Among international teams, WPDU has entertained the British, Japanese, New Zealand, South African, Russian, and Irish national teams, with plans to host students from Rwanda in late 2023. Dr. Bedford earned her PhD from Duquesne University with concentrations in organizational communication, interpersonal communication, and communication ethics in the public sphere, and has continued her research into interdisciplinary consequence or rhetorical studies in education. In addition to the release of a book chapter in early 2024, she has a proposal under current review. Welcome, Dr. Bedford.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to tonight's session. I just want to invite you, this is a discussion about civil discourse, and so we have to have discourse. So if you do have any questions or you want to contribute anything, please feel free. And when I'm in a classroom, my students can always say, slow down, can we go back over that? And, it's a little bit more difficult in this setting. And the other thing I would like to mention is as Britton explained, we have been having some technical difficulties. I had technical difficulties on my end last week and could not show you the PowerPoint. So I apologize for that because it is very difficult to follow along when you're talking about the complexity of the subject matter we're dealing with here without a PowerPoint. So I think it's functioning and working today. Let us know if you cannot see the screen. And let's just get right into things tonight and talk about the importance of civil discourse. So I want to just go over, and don't pay attention to these page numbers. For some reason, they keep popping up. I keep deleting them, but we're going to establish what civil discourse is to you. So when someone talks about civil discourse, we all get different ideas about what that means. So I'm kind of curious and would like to hear what you think civil discourse is. We're going to establish some of the causes as to why discourse devolves into incivility by talking about the difference between public and private issues and what territory each of those covers. We're going to establish the root of civil discourse in ethical communication. And within that context, discuss how we can hold ourselves accountable. And I'd like to just check the chat. Yes, we do have audio on. It seems as though someone is having some difficulty with audio. And I know that came up last week for some people. So I'm not sure how much we can do about that from our end, but please definitely let us know if that problem continues. So I would like to first just touch upon something that was written by an individual by the name of Derek Webb. And he wrote this for the South Carolina Law Review. And it's a good way of establishing the original meaning of civility because this was something that came about during the Democratic deliberation at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. And he describes what it was like, what the atmosphere was like there. So I'll just read from his abstract so that you can kind of get a sense in terms of when we're dealing in public settings. We do have this expectation that civility should exist, but particularly when we are involved in political issues and in governmental related settings, we can very quickly decline. And that includes what we'll be talking about next week with mass media. So he says for the past 20 years, legal scholars have pored over the records of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention for insights into how to best interpret the Constitution's various provisions. In this essay, I pore over these same materials for insights into how the delegates to the convention themselves maintained a level of civility through 4 months of grueling deliberations. At a time when our legislative assemblies, still today populated mostly by lawyers, are all too often prone to incivility, ad hominem argumentation, which is an ad hominem attack, is an attack against the person, not the issue, or the credibility of the person. We are also steeped in polarization and resistance to compromise. The ups and downs of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention may yet prove a fruitful model for constructive dialogue. In particularly, I argue that the convention was marked by a surprising degree of civic friendship born out of frequent interaction, daily dinner parties that cut across party and sectional lines, and a variety of parliamentary procedures designed to encourage open mindedness and rational deliberation. Upon this foundation of civic friendship, the delegates reasoned together, utilizing a form of public reason when deliberating about more abstract structural matters, and compromising when deliberation broke down over issues that cut deep into economic and political interests. This rich but often overlooked story of our nation's founding deserves a telling for lawyers and politicians alike. So this builds upon what we talked about last week when we were discussing the various components that are required in order to have a good argument, one of which is a reasonable person expectation among all of the parties involved. And so I will just go over that a little bit to remind you that if you decide that you want to engage in discourse with someone and potentially an argument with someone, you have to go into that with the mindset that you intend to be a reasonable person and hold that other person in the same regard, assuming that they want to be a reasonable person as well in that exchange. And so the first phase of establishing what civil discourse looks like is that type of an agreement where you have to embody that yourself in your own approach to the interaction, and assume that on the other side that you're not dealing with bad people, you're not dealing with people that you should by nature dislike because they're different. You may have differences of opinion, you may have different ideas about the world, but that does not mean that you cannot collaboratively construct a mutual, reasonable body of discourse together. So that is really the basis upon which I believe we can establish what civil discourse looks like for us. And again, if you have any questions or comments about that, please definitely, talk to me about that. So one of the primary goals that we're going to try to achieve tonight is establishing what situations where you have felt that there has been incivility in the exchange you're having with someone else. And that can be in a public setting, it can be via social media, and it can be on an interpersonal level. And so it's very difficult sometimes to figure out what goes wrong and why that happens. And so the other part of that goal is establishing we need to know the difference between what should be public and what should be private. And we have a lot of confusion in our culture right now. And I think a lot of it is an evolution of the reality TV kind of social construction of what relationships look like, what communication looks like. It's often, riddled with a lot of conflict. And that is presented as though that is the way people are supposed to communicate in their daily lives. And that's just not the case. We should embrace civility even through difference. So I would like to ask you, what does civil discourse mean to you? That is an important question. And the thing about that question is that we all have different perceptions of what that looks like, and being that it is defined by individuals, here's what I'm saying. It is rooted in our values and it is applied across multiple contexts. But the thing that we don't really recognize is that some people by nature tend to embrace conflict in a different way than others. So maybe you were raised in an environment where you had a lot of conflict, and in your home, it was perfectly acceptable to engage in conflict with each other. And, with the understanding that no one meant anything, no one meant any harm by that, but you just, some family groups, some families just believe that it is a part of the way they communicate. Some people don't like to argue at all. And so they will, avoid issues. And that doesn't lead to a good outcome either, because then things tend to brew and stir. And we talked last week about establishing some type of system that you can hold yourselves accountable to in an exchange, especially when things become heated. And it's really important to capture things when they begin. When you feel that emotional response set in, and you feel that you are about to have a reaction that you really don't want to have in that exchange, which is going to definitely cause the conversation to decline into incivility, it's really important to catch that in the beginning, and allow those rules you've set for your exchange to kick in and say, I feel myself becoming emotional. I don't want to go to that place. I would rather have a rational discourse with this person. And so maybe one of the agreements that we set was to, okay, one of us at any point during this conversation can say, I need a break. I need to get up and go and get some fresh air. I know that as a part of this agreement, I have to come back to the table and continue this conversation. But in order for us to continue, I need to calm down. So that is one of the first and most important things that you can do, establishing those ground rules. And then when they become important, because it's really easy to establish ground rules, it's much more difficult to act upon them when you're in the situation. And so you have to make conscious decisions about how you're going to approach that. So I have one respondent saying that civil discourse means respectfully agreeing to disagree. And I think that is a valid point to make. We also talked about, not always being able to establish common ground when we are engaged in a conflict with someone. It's simply not possible all the time, because to establish common ground, sometimes that would call upon you to maybe abandon your values that you really feel are important to you. And if you're not willing and you can't do that, in order to come to a common agreement, maybe you establish a new way of engaging about whatever it is. And so it's new ground that you need to establish, not common ground in those situations. And I also talked about Julia Wood, an interpersonal scholar, and read some quotes from her regarding that situation, meaning that, common ground is something that it's rooted in prescriptive ideas about the interaction that we may be bringing to the table. And so common ground can be limiting for that reason. And it can cause us to not be as open as we want to be if we are going to be reasonable people in that exchange. And so we have to set a different set of terms that say, maybe what we need to do is just have a clean slate altogether and wipe away everything that we believe and know about this and begin to communicate with each other in a different sort of a way. And so in that process, Wood also said that we can open ourselves up to something that we did not know we even had the capability to become. If we find ourselves not judging, not predetermining what it is that we're going to say, and we prove to ourselves that we can really be reasonable and rational in that interaction, and learn something, because the potential for learning is immense if we create those kinds of rules for ourselves. So we have mutual rules, and then we have rules for ourselves, and those rules include holding to the rules that we establish for our exchange together. So this takes on a different dimension sometimes when we're talking about discourse that's taking place in a public setting, because what we call rational public discourse tends to be a little bit different. And so if we want to really establish what civil discourse looks like, we started with that original meaning of it. But if we're going to establish ground rules for having arguments in public settings, that accountability has to be a little bit higher, because now we're interacting with people who are making claims. And making a claim in an argument is stating your position. You're stating, this is how I feel about this, but you need to go further than that and state what your reasons are for believing that statement or that claim is true. And in public settings, too often, and in media, which we'll talk about next week, you don't always see that. You see claims, but you don't really see the presentation of valid reasons that justify that, or evidence that supports those reasons. And so, in addition to having reasonable people now, We need to be able to hold each other accountable, especially when we're talking about issues that are highly volatile in the first place. We talked about evidence last week and the importance of establishing what evidence is. So we said evidence can be stories. You can tell a story about how something impacted your life. And in argument, we call those anecdotes, anecdotal accounts as to what, how someone was impacted by a situation or an event or something that took place. And we apply that in various ways. For example, we'll talk about when someone takes a medication and they are talking about how that medication affected them. And then you get a bunch of stories online where everybody starts talking about this. And from those anecdotal accounts, you can develop a larger interest that someone takes on in the form of a case study. And so don't discount the importance of storytelling, because it's an important way to create an experience where someone would not otherwise have the opportunity to have that level of understanding about it. But that also means that we have ethical responsibilities and obligations to one another when we're involved in these exchanges. And if someone presents information that you disagree with, that is not the time to blow up or, confront that person and engage in that ad hominem attack that we talked about in the definition of the original meaning of civility. And it was not really a definition, but a sentiment. And when we think about the ethical responsibility of language, people use a lot of words, they throw around a lot of terms, and sometimes those can be very insulting. And so, in a civil exchange, what you can do if that arises is say, look, I'm not really comfortable with the terminology you're using, and this is the reason why. So, what you're saying is that I value the respectful way that we agreed we are going to communicate with each other. I also talked about the fact that if we don't establish our values, people can't understand us. And so by saying, I value a certain type of communication, and in fact, we agreed that's the way we are going to communicate with each other. And so we have an ethical obligation to uphold that agreement. So civil discourse does take on other dimensions when we start talking about public and private. So, um, you know, one thing we want to understand is what respect means, especially when you get involved in these larger types of arguments. And Thomas Nilsson authored a book called uh, The Ethics of Speech Communication, and it's a really old book. I think it was written in the 60s. And he talked about respect as a first commandment in the discipline by which a man can be educated to maturity, intellectual, emotional, and moral. So he said, respect for the word, to employ it with scrupulous care and incorruptible, heartfelt love of truth, is essential if there is to be any growth in a society in the human race. To misuse the word is to show contempt for man. It undermines the bridges and poisons the well. It causes men to regress down the long path of his evolution. And so, if you think about what he's saying there, when we continue to engage in this uncivilized manner of exchange with each other, we are setting ourselves back. We've made a lot of progress. If you think about where we are in our culture, our society, we have all of these opportunities to communicate about things in a manner that is respectful, but we just make choices not to do that. And so we can begin examining civility and discourse as a means by which we establish first what it is in relation to other people. So, what's the point of talking about civility, in other words, if it is not in relation to other people? You can sit in your home and be uncivilized all you want. Put your feet up on the chair and, eat loudly, and there isn't going to necessarily be anybody there to say anything about it. Use shout, curse words, whatever it is. But it's not until you are in an exchange with someone else, that any of that matters. So that's another way that we can now begin to think about what civil discourse looks like. So he goes on to say that through words, we affect the well being of other people. So, in peculiarly subtle and significant ways. In our private lives, where, our personalities touch each other, it's one thing. And sometimes we do that because, look, people get angry, especially in families. But when it takes on a public dimension to it, those are the issues that can affect the life and society of other people, if particularly if we continue to behave in these ways. And so, in practical terms, we have to view civility as an interaction with other people, whether that is in a public setting or a private setting. And so, we're placing the human personality at the center of these values, in the assumptions that we're making that as human beings we are interacting, we are rubbing up against other personalities with our personality. And that means that we have to have a sense of freedom, equality, and respect. So, freedom to say what we really believe we need to say, equality in the sense that we have an egalitarian approach to this. Everybody has the right to participate in that, but we do that in a manner that is respectful of everyone who is actually involved in that conversation. And so when we think about that as a principle that travels both ways, we have to think of that as an ethical obligation. And so, especially in highly controversial arguments, we have to set aside that desire to change people's minds and be right. We all want people to agree with us. We all want people to like us. But an exchange between people that is dealing especially with highly controversial stuff, that cannot be your goal. You have to have an exchange of reasoned views and intended to bring about understanding, not try and bang someone over the head and make them believe that what the way you see the world is the way they need to see the world, because most of the time that's not going to happen. And so there are actually scholars who believe that these overtly persuasive attempts to persuade people are actually a kind of aggression, and it's an act of incivility. And there's an author, it just comes to mind as I'm talking about this. Emmanuel Levinas is a German philosopher and phenomenologist, and he was alive. I think he died back in the 80s, actually, but he was alive. He was very old when he passed away, very old. He was alive during the Holocaust, and he lost a lot of family during that time. And so he ended up using that experience to write about the times in which we lose the ability to see each other's faces. When you don't have the ability, you lose the ability to see the face of another, you objectify that person, and that causes you to be able to totalize that person or commit an act of violence against that face that you don't have the ability to recognize. And so when we start talking about interacting with people, we have to remember we're dealing with human beings. And even if we're different, we have to make an intended, decisive, move to notice their faces. And think about what it's like when you look into someone's eyes and they're talking to you. It feels very different than when you turn your head away or you're not making direct eye contact, because that is an aspect of that personal accountability. And you need to be able to, say with all honesty, look, I just want to tell you what I think, and it's okay to say that, but you have to be on the receiving end if that person also says that they want to say what they truly think, and in turn, you might have to agree to disagree. So you cannot, go down the path of trying to forcefully persuade someone to buy into whatever it is that you're talking about. And so when we're talking about public and private issues, we need to make this distinction about what is appropriate to say in public and in public forums such as social media, and what do we need to keep private unto ourselves in our homes so that we are not reacting to things that don't impact us directly. So remember last week we talked about stakeholders and participants in exchanges. A stakeholder is someone who has a direct interest in the outcome of something. It could be a policy decision, it could be a set of practices that are being put into place. But let's take a look now at what it means from a definitional perspective so that you can gain a better sense as to how to navigate those two things. If you have a stake in something, it means one thing. If you are a participant in it, and this discourse is meaningful because even if you don't have a direct stake, you could have an indirect impact of something. So we always frame things in the sense of them being for the public good, but let's take a look at what this actually means. So when we talk about the public sphere, this is actually an economic distinction that is used to define individual identifiable people that are benefiting from a particular type of good. So in other words, if everybody is using the road, right, and roadways and bridges, they're designed and built for the public. And so that means that everyone is mutually benefiting from that public good. We can think about education in the same way, that public education is designed for the mutual benefit of the good. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to the latest decision in PA about education, but you know that public schools have been funded by property taxes forever. Some states have already started to re-examine that, and PA is now coming to terms with the fact that it's not an equitable distribution of the equal access principle, because not everybody has equal access if you have a school in your neighborhood, but it's not equitable if everybody is not benefiting from it in the same way. So in other words, if you live in a town where you have a lot of money and there's a lot of money being poured into the schools, they have books and they have the money to bring in the latest technologies and hire good teachers and staff. And so it's inequitable if someone doesn't. So that is a public good. And so that's the reason why issues like that, when they are being talked about in public forums, if you're paying property taxes, if your children are in school, even if you don't have children, it doesn't matter. That's a public good because we're all paying into that. So this matters because sometimes there are things that just aren't designed for public consumption. They're private if only an individual can benefit from that. And you can think about education in the same way. So if your child goes to a private school and you're paying tons of money for that individualized attention and access to, all of these resources, it's not designed to be equitable because you're paying money for that. And it's also not a public good because your child is benefiting from that. And so we need to begin to set in our minds the difference when something has a public impact, and we need to be a part of that conversation. But we also need to think about where that type of conversation should be taking place and with whom. Is it helpful to get on social media and start ripping each other apart, talking about things that have no direct consequence over us? So if we have a vote, that's one thing. If something should be kept in the private sphere because it impacts someone's personal life, then leave it in the private where it belongs. And so this is another step in developing civility in discourse between people, because too often people magnify private issues, just as I was talking about the reality TV problem that we have, making people believe that if it's an issue for them, then everybody needs to take part in this discussion. And we see a lot of ugliness result from that kind of stuff. And so let's just take a look at how we can, in distinguishing the difference between what should be talked about in public and what forums we should be having those discussions, what we need to do to hold ourselves accountable to ethical discourse. And I'll check the chat because it looks as though we have a comment. So the comment is, does that mean that we are all stakeholders in some way as members of the community? Yes, if it means it is an issue that directly impacts your experience. So if public education is the issue and you are paying taxes, I'll give you an example. I used to live in a district with my family, and we were paying, our school board used to raise taxes pretty regularly, and it was always justified on the basis that, oh, we need new facilities. Well, you just remodeled that school 2 years ago. Do you really need to now tear that school down and build a new school? And so this was happening to the point where people were being kicked out of their homes because they just could not afford. The taxes were overtaking the actual payment, mortgage payment. And so when that becomes an issue, yes, those types of issues are community issues. Some of the stuff that you're, and I'm, probably going to make some people upset by this, but some of the issues out there in the mainstream that don't get a vote, that are personal decisions that we have to make in our lives for very good reasons, because we all make decisions out of what we believe to be good reasons. Those things we need to, you know, make sure that we understand the difference. So if I'm in a situation and I'm advocating my own position on something because it directly impacts my experience, it directly affects what I am, trying to accomplish in my life and what I need to do to protect myself, to feel safe, to feel that I am experiencing a good and healthy life, that does not need to be taken out into the open. So if I am advocating on my own behalf, all I can do in that situation is accurately represent my own views about what is impacting my own life. And likewise, we have to regard when other people do that, even if we disagree with them. And if it's an issue like that, you know that that is probably taking place in a private setting. So we don't need to take everything out into the world and, look at, what someone is deciding to do in their lives. But we do have to be respectful if a family member comes and says, look, this is what I'm doing in my life. I want you to know because, I'm going to expect you to interact with me differently. And I'm going to need for you to recognize that this is an important issue for me, and you just have to hold your tongue because it's not your right to make judgment on that person's decisions or what they need to do for their lives. Now, if that person then takes that issue to social media and they make that issue public, I would just make the reasoned decision not to participate in that conversation because that does not directly impact my personal experience. That person has made that decision, and whoever equally makes that decision to get involved in it, oftentimes those are the times when things get very ugly and they escalate. And, then we start, excluding people and shouting at people and engaging in all of the behaviors that we're trying to work against. And so when we think about those ethical obligations in discourse, we have to also think about what we need to do when we're on the other end of something that is happening and we absolutely hate it, we disagree with it. And I said sometimes you have to bite your tongue, but you're expecting that person to do the same thing for you. So this involves listening. So when you're listening, you're an audience to someone, you're an audience to whoever it is that's speaking in that moment. And so we talked about some strategies last week to keep things civil, especially when there's a heated exchange and you're having trouble listening because you're holding on to the last thing that made you angry that the person said. And that's when those rules kick in. But we also have to understand what true listening means. There's a difference between listening as an auditory event and listening as an active event. Active listening does not involve the senses because it is a mental activity. And we are making a decision that we are going to follow along what someone is presenting to us in an argument. And sometimes, my friends and I talk about uh, when my son was really small, he used to write what we call bad notes to us. And, he would tell us, you did this, and it started out as frowny faces. And my response as a parent could have been to personalize that because he was angry, or to look at the toddler that was using this form of communication for me. And even though I'm looking at something on paper, because listening is also a reading event, listening is, like I said, it's not just auditory, it is when you're reading something and you might be reading something you disagree with. So my response, I had to look at the toddler and realize he's trying to communicate something important to me, and this is his way of doing it. And so he would throw the bad note down at my feet, and he would run away. And then he would just sulk a little while. So I would let him sulk, and then I would just come in, I would sit, I'd get at eye level with him. Now, I'm not trying to present myself as a perfect parent, because we all have had times when we haven't engaged with our children perfectly. But I would get on his eye level and just try to understand what's going on with this child and what is he trying to tell me. And when children don't have the grasp of language that we do, they communicate to us in different ways. So we have to think in terms of other people as having a different framework for communicating with us as well. So when we're listening, sometimes people communicate using the only means they have available to them, using the only language they have at their disposal, using the only communication skills they possess, using the only form of language that meets the educational level that they have. And so sometimes we have to do just like I'm describing with my toddler and get at that eye level. I'm not talking about being elite. I'm not talking about judging someone. I'm saying we have to be able to meet each other where we are. And so if we practice that type of critical listening and force ourselves when somebody else is advocating on their position, on their behalf, then, we give them the opportunity to know that they're being supported in that, even if it's coming across in a way that may make us feel uncomfortable. So that's the fourth part of this, that sometimes communication happens in a way that we don't necessarily like or feel, comfortable with. And that's when that ethical obligation comes in. So I'm going to actively listen. I'm going to understand this person is doing their best. And this is all that they can do. And I'm going to decide that I'm not going to put them down. I'm not going to make them feel like what they're saying is invalid in any way just because they don't have the same way of communicating. And there are gender differences in communication, and you can read the studies on that kind of thing. And there are a lot of issues about gender and a lot of disagreements about gender, but I'm referring to documented research. And so that research says that we have different ways of communicating. And you know uh, that is just something that is a function of who we are. And so whoever you are within yourself, what your abilities are. And when I'm teaching argument and various other types of classes, we look at what's called communication process models. And those models reflect communication as something that is very dynamic. You start with this sender, and then that message has to travel all the way to the receiver on the other side so that they can make an informed decision. So that requires active listening. And there can be, the reason why it's considered to be dynamic is that there are so many possible opportunities for noise to kick in. Noise is considered to be a barrier. A barrier can be your mood. A barrier can be, as I said, your communication skills, your educational level. It can be your cultural awareness. It can be many different things. It can even be you're sitting in a hot room and you can't pay attention because you're sweltering. It's just too hot. Try to pay attention to what is causing you to have difficulty listening in those situations, and make a personal adjustment so that you can be the listener that you want the other person to be. And so the other part of it is that at the end, after you have, hammered through this, because we also talked last week about the fact that arguments unfold over time, and it does take sometimes many different interactions to resolve something. And even if that is an agreement that you just have to disagree with this thing, to be able to make an informed decision about that means that person still has the right to disagree and, hold unto themselves what it is that they want. And like I said, don't commit an act of violence against that person by not being the active listener that they need for you to be. So, one of the interesting things that happens in our society is that sometimes occasions arise and we socially make decisions that we're going to interact differently or engage with each other differently because a public sentiment sets in, especially following tragedies. So I want you to have another kind of awareness about how rhetorical occasions and experiences can give rise to new opportunities. And if we really want to participate in the process of argumentation, it also takes a commitment that we're going to stick to that agreement and we're going to stick to the change. But we're going to talk in a second here about why that continues to be a problem, especially surrounding certain occasions, and they are topic driven. And so this is another place where incivility comes forward. So, um, the Thomas Farrell wrote a book called Norms of Rhetorical Culture, and I think I've put that in the list of references at the end here as well. And he talked about these rhetorical occasions and experiences where, we're often pitted against one another or another culture that occupies a radically discrepant position from the one that we know. And that can be along any dimension. It could be identity. It could be something about cohesion or coherency. It could be development. It can be anything. And so when something is, it seems like a pair, something is just not adding up. And, that kind of incoherence, incohesion, it can cause us to become angered in a situation because someone said they're going to do something or something's supposed to work in the way that it's supposed to work, and things just aren't aligning the way they're supposed to. And so when we speak about coherence, we're talking about the reality of being a captive audience, and especially where we're talking about political stuff. We have all of these kinds of political seating arrangements, he describes them, and he talks about these types of environments that function like faculty clubs, where you have these cultures that are, engaging in this misreading of each other and misspelling. And those are very, simple ways of saying that we can get embroiled in that kind of stuff, and we can start to hold on to that kind of thing, and getting confrontational on that basis of the misreadings and the misunderstandings. And you said you were going to do this and you haven't kept that promise. Or we can figure out that in the cultural life world, you know there is this, we can have two different types of regimes where one has that considerable power over the definitions of what life is supposed to look like, and they engage in things like promises because sometimes they're naive. Sometimes they don't know what's actually involved in making something work and keeping that promise. And we can be the regime of pure intolerance, or and say, look, you said you were going to do that thing and now you're not doing that thing. And in those situations, we're treating life as though, remember I said, things are not pro con, things are not black and white, things are not easy. And so those are not ethical responsibilities, those are not ethical obligations to attack someone and say you're not keeping your word. We can hold each other accountable and go back and reference something and say maybe we need to revisit this issue and talk about why this became so complicated, or talk about what the challenges are in bringing this forward or making this happen, and negotiate how we can make this happen in a way that will not cause anyone to feel at fault. Because the minute you say you're at fault or you're wrong or you've done something that has, in violation, those are inflammatory remarks that lead to an utter decline. And so we have to liberate ourselves from our need to do those things. And we need to liberate our expectations of other people, because we're all human beings. And we have to go beyond our immediate experience to think about, okay, if that person um, made this set of statements and they didn't follow through with that, what happened? Don't assume that, look, they didn't want to do it, they're lazy, they're dishonest, any of that other stuff. Just assume I don't understand everything that's going on here. Okay? And so Farrell also talks about this ensemble of convictions and affiliations and traditions that we have. And so when we have the potential for that circle to be widened, sometimes through misunderstandings and things that fall outside of our immediate experience, we can reject that opportunity. And we talked about that extensively when we were discussing wood last week. Um, and, the problem is we have to reflect on and examine our own positioning on things and get rid of the doxa, or the thinking that we kind of default to when something goes wrong. We get upset, we make accusations, we make claims ourselves, and these are prescriptive ways of thinking about what is normal and how things are supposed to work. And sometimes those things arise surrounding different occasions. And the fact that things don't always happen, especially in the public sphere, the way we want them to. And part of it is because we can't talk about things in a civilized manner. And so, we have to really begin to think about, how do we get beyond this prescriptive setting that we put ourselves in, of being this captive audience to these notions that we have, these ways of thinking, because we do hold ourselves captive in those situations. And we make it very difficult for other people to interact with us. And so I'll reference one of the things that I'm talking about when we're discussing these public events, because we kind of have to go there in speaking about how incivility arising. So I made mention about things that belong in the public sphere and things that don't. One of the things that does belong in the public sphere are the arguments we're having over gun rights. And we always look to, you know, we have the Second Amendment, we have to adhere to that. And so you get these groups and it becomes very divisive. And those are the situations when this kind of thing comes into play. You cannot allow yourself to decline into these arguments based upon, do you have a gun? I don't like that you have a gun. But that person has no ill intent in using the gun. They might have the gun for safety or protection, or, they might shoot cans with their kids. They don't have the mindset to be violent, but somebody else that has the mindset to be violent. And so we divide things along these neat lines. And then we have arguments about, okay, school shootings and why they're happening. Is it video games? Is it parents not watching their kids enough? And so all of these are accusations and misunderstandings. They do not reflect any meaningful discourse. There's a place for everything, there's a purpose for everything, and we can't just start ruling out rights. We can't start ruling out um, the right to speak, or the right of ownership, the right to privacy, any of those things. As soon as we start declining into this uncivilized way of talking about things and diminishing subjects, that are just extremely highly complex like that, into something that is simplified and politicized. And so as soon as you politicize something, it immediately takes on a different dimension. But I want to just talk about something else in this article that I was mentioning, written by Derek Webb, when he was talking about the civilized nature of discourse that took place at the Democratic um, declaration or deliberation at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. And he talks about that within the context of school shootings, which is the reason why I bring that up. And he says that this was after he talks about school shootings, and he also talks about public shootings that have taken place in open squares. And so these types of issues are definitely public. So they do need to be talked about in a public way, but we just don't know how. But he talks about what happened on January 8th when Jared Lee Loughner fired on a group of people, and Gabby Gifford was the congresswoman for Arizona at that time. And there was some type of an event, and it was something like it was a meet and greet. Let me check my notes here. It was called Congress on Your Corner. And she was there to basically meet her constituents. She was there with a bunch of her staffers, and 13 people were injured, including Gabby Giffords. And she just never came back from that. She was not able to come back to Congress. She had severe head wounds. And so this again elevated that discourse about gun ownership and things. 6 people were killed, and including a district judge and one of her staff members and a 9-year-old child. And so these are highly emotional topics. And so sometimes the emotion of these topics makes it very difficult for us to talk about things. And so he talks about, days after, and presidents are supposed to respond. That's their job, to respond to public events. And this happened during President Obama's administration. And I want to remove any notions that I'm attempting to politicize anything, because I'm an independent and everybody is equal opportunity to me. So, but he talks about the way President Obama responded to that. And so he says, Obama called for a new era of civility in honor of those who had lost their lives in the tragedy, while careful to avoid claiming that political incivility was itself the cause of Loughner's actions. He suggested that the tragedy should serve as an occasion to reevaluate the tenor of national political debate. He said, at a time when our discourse has become so sharply polarized, at a time when we are far too eager to lay blame for all that ails the world at the feet of those who happen to think differently than we do, it's important for us to pause for a moment and make sure that we're talking with each other in a way that heals, not in a way that wounds. And so later he said, if, as has been discussed in recent days, the death of these individuals helps usher in more civility in our public discourse, let us remember it is not because a simple lack of civility caused this tragedy. It did not, but rather because only a more civil and honest public discourse can help us face up to the challenges of our nation in a way that would make them proud. And so the victims proud. And so after that, there were a lot of people that came together and made decisions about we're going to be ethically responsible in our discourse, particularly around this type of subject. And so you had politicians, commentators, people across all political realms, academics getting together, talking about ways that we need to use this as an example. And so how many times has this happened since then? But we still find it very difficult to talk about it. And so at his State of the Union address, he again, he went and talked about crossing of the aisles and, people sitting next to each other during the speech. And, noting that this was a palpable difference from what had been observed in previous ones, and certainly subsequent to that, because we see a lot of incivility in Congress now. And he also, Webb also, I'm sorry, not Webb, Webb, Derek Webb, said that in February of 2011, after that, and this is something that's really significant, the University of Arizona announced that it was establishing a National Institute for Civic Discourse, with former presidents George H. Bush and Bill Clinton serving as honorary chairman. And so the whole purpose of that was to find ways to encourage compromise and, between competing parties and political groups. And so the bottom line is that this can happen. We just have to, you know, break things down and really examine why things fall apart every time something public happens and we fail to resolve it because we can't talk. We can't talk about it. We can't, allow the emotion to die down because, as I said last week, emotion is the killer to any meaningful discourse taking place because we can't recognize that our emotional responses are patterns of conduct, and we have to break that cycle somehow. And so I think if you're ever going to achieve civility in discourse, these are all of the ways that we have to do it. We have to go back and think about what is civil discourse? What does it mean to me? What are the ethical dimensions of that? What does ethical discourse mean to me? How do I apply that in my relationship with other people? Because civility matters when we are interacting with people. And so when I was talking about personality and personalities colliding, that's when we have to do that kind of holding of the tongue and recognizing differences in communication styles and all of these different ways that they happen, and hold not just each other accountable, but on a very personal level, make decisions about how we are going to hold ourselves accountable in those exchanges. And again, I'll reiterate the importance of establishing rules of interaction and holding to those rules, because it's most difficult to hold to those rules when you're embroiled in a contentious debate with someone. And so when I'm teaching debate, these are the things that we practice. And when we are talking about public issues that impact many different people, we set the arguments up. I typically assign randomly who's going to debate on what. And we do the research together. We understand what all of the perspectives are, and we set the argument up so that there is a back and forth exchange. And we're teaching people that this is the way it should happen, in a respectful way, where one person is speaking, the other person sits back and listens. Then the next person, that person comes back and maybe makes a comment about that. They can even give a rebuttal or disagree. But that disagreement has to happen in a respectful way. And even if you come back and disagree with a disagreement, those are the places where incivility comes in, when disagreement arises. And so, like I said, we all want to be agreed with, we all want to be liked, but we have to let go of our emotional desire for those things when we really need to engage in reasoned discourse with other people. So that's really, in a nutshell, very um, concise kind of overview of what civility involves, because it is much deeper than that. But at this point, I would like to open the floor to experiences people have with incivility or have had that are challenging or frustrating, and also just give people the opportunity to add insights as to, ways they perceive civility either falling apart or coming together in different settings. So I'm going to stop my screen share so that we can do that. Would anyone like to ask any questions? Or share an experience about when incivility took place in your life?
I just want to let people know as well that if you prefer to talk, you can just let us know in the chat, and I think I can click on allow to talk. But remember, it's being recorded if you feel uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes it's easier to speak about something than, writing an extensive detailed account about your experience. So if you would like to share an experience with us, because we're coming together as a community here and trying to understand each other better and trying to understand what our needs are in regard to civil discourse as well. I think we have different features where you can put your hand up, right, Britton, and people can ask to speak.
That's right.
Okay, someone is offering an insight. I find that some anonymous insulting t-shirt messages are a different variety of incivility. I don't understand why people want to insult total strangers. So I do want to comment on that because there are a couple of things about this. A t-shirt is what is called a multimodal form of communication. Number one, it is being worn by a person. Number two, there are messages that are being displayed on those things. And so sometimes people like to get attention. And sometimes they like for the world to know that they have opinions. And this is one of the things that I'm talking about when I have to when I say sometimes we have to forgive people that have different forms of communication than we do and decide that, well, this is the way this person has decided to interact with the world. And maybe they don't necessarily want to insult other people. Maybe they want to be cheeky, but really what they're doing is trying to get attention. And in those situations, I think the best thing for you to do is to decide, I'm not going to allow myself to feel insulted by some expression someone has decided to make publicly, because we talk in argument about visuals as a form of argumentation, and you can definitely count that as a form of incivility. And so that does come down every single day. We're going through 1,001 decisions that we have to make about, am I going to be insulted by this? Am I going to allow this person to have this degree of power and influence over my day? And this is not to diminish or put down you feeling insulted, because there are some highly personalized things. And it's interesting because I was just talking to my students today about bumper stickers and, some of the expletives you see on them and some of the insulting things and offensive things that you see on bumper stickers, billboards, all of that is a form of argumentation. And it's called, as I said, multimodal, because you have words, you have colors, and so they're designed for the most intensive, emotional response. And so knowing that might help you realize that this is for the shock value. And I am not going to give this the attention this person is demanding. I mean, does that make sense to you, or does that feel as though I'm putting down what you're saying? And I think that was Val that made that comment. Well, I'll tell you, social media has changed a lot of things. And there's a principle that we refer to in communication called anonymity and presence. What that means is that people can be present in conversations about things, and they can feel anonymous at the same time. And so that gives them license to say, um, anything they want to say. And a lot of times people present themselves falsely in social media, and they, will say things that they would never say in any other setting other than that. And so, feeling anonymous can make people, because, there's a lot of bullying that takes place in social media. There's a lot of violent type of communication. And I personally got off of social media because I just didn't want that in my life anymore. I made the decision to get off of Facebook and anything else. I think I still have an Instagram account, but I haven't looked at it in 3 years. And same thing for Twitter, and I just never got around to deleting them. I just don't want that in my life anymore. And so those platforms were established to give friends and family opportunities to connect with one another, but they have degraded vastly into opportunities for people to be hateful and mean. And I just don't find that I can navigate through that type of a platform and feel good. I found myself getting upset, reading things, and then people, maybe you put a post up and then someone doesn't like it and they come back at you. Again, that's an opportunity to say, this is a public issue or a private issue. If I made a post to my friends, no outsider should be making a comment. So you need to change your settings on who can respond and make comments on things. And there are some subjects that are talked about very openly in social media. And unfortunately, a lot of people use social media for news. And so they're on there all the time. And, you know, um, we do have to think about that. And I think it does come down to making personal decisions. I'm going to respond to that. I'm not going to respond to that because that's a hateful comment and I don't have to. Because if you report those things, Facebook almost never does anything about it. They're not regulated. They're not really considered a part of media, even though that is under, examination right now, and Congress has been looking at that. So I'm not sure what we can do about it, but we definitely do need to pay more attention to the way. All we can do is control what we're doing, and so I think that's really what we have to do. And so let's take a look at another comment. I'd like to say that what a person says tells you more about them than the person uh, or subject they are talking about, and that's true. And I think if we hold that as a principle in, especially in reading things on social media, it can help us a lot to, just all we can do. We have our own private sphere. So there are many different spheres, and we have a private sphere, and we can determine what happens in that sphere. So the next thing, I think the point is to understand really that people want attention. And when you know that the best is not to get yourself involved and ignore, even when it is in social media, it really tells you who you are and what the other person is too. And I agree with that. I think we have to just. I actually, to be honest with you, I ended up having to cut some people out of my life because of the violent nature of their speech. And I decided for myself that it was violent and hurtful to other people. I didn't feel personally hurt because I know that people do have the tendency to be brash and rude and seek attention. All these attention seeking behaviors, need a response in order to become inflated. And so it took a number of years for me to make that decision, but it got to the point where because of the politics in our culture and the nature of discourse that was taking place, I just decided that people can cause things to change themselves in ways that are very negative. And I think when you start responding to stuff like that, it can cause you to change yourself and cause you to decline as a person. And so I just decided I didn't want that anymore. So someone else is saying, Elise is saying, there have been occasions in my life when I have been both civil and uncivil. And so I appreciate these insights. And yes, absolutely, we are human beings. And it's as I said earlier, we get angry and we say things we don't mean. And when we do that with family, they're more likely to forgive us. But when we're doing that on public forums like Facebook, I think we just have to rein ourselves in. I think that's the only real choice that we can make because, we absolutely cannot control what anyone else is doing. And the more we make personal decisions to do that, I think it begins to erase the need people have for that attention because they'll just stop getting it. And I think that's one answer to that. Any other thoughts or experiences you would like to share? I think all these comments have been very meaningful because I think incivility resonates with a lot of people. And I remember, you know, over the last several years, sitting around dinner tables and just, Thanksgiving having to say, oh, or setting up agreements about, hey, the family's coming over. If this comes up, we're just going to redirect. We're not going to get into that. And if they start talking about that, let them say their piece and then let's just change the subject. And we can't get rid of family. We can't necessarily cut family. People sometimes have to make those decisions, but you know, we have to be able to love people despite themselves sometimes, despite ourselves. We expect people to love us. And I think that's a good starting point as well. Just trying to figure out, how to set some ground rules so we can overcome some of these problems. So, what do you think about the discourse surrounding transgender folks? Mostly, I'm wondering how to handle it when someone denies the existence of a person or denies experiences such as the conversation around systemic racism. So, it's interesting because we've been holding debates about issues surrounding transgender rights, and we did a debate on gender neutrality and inclusivity in the use of public facilities. And I think one of the worst things we can do is tell people that they can't express their viewpoints, what they really think and believe about something, as long as they are doing it in a respectful manner. And things like the isms, such as racism, that's not respect. Systemic racism is on an institutional level. And institutions engage in racism all the time. Just asking, the mere act of asking someone to check a box and identify themselves in that way. And this is now going into the territory of gender, I think is a personal violation to me. I don't appreciate that when that happens. And so those are ways that we continue to feed into systemic problems such as that. But we have to be able to share concerns and ask important questions because sometimes people ask questions that seem offensive, but they're asking because they really just don't understand. And we can either get angry at that or we can try to explain if that is our job. If that's not our job and we perceive what they're talking about as hateful, certainly denying someone, my view is that a person is born to be who they are. It's not as though a person comes into the world and decides that they want to have the most difficult life possible by making a choice. It's not a choice. And so denying someone's identity is a form of violence to me. But that's my personal view on it. I am surrounded by others who have different views on it. So I think that it depends on the situation. Everything is situational. Who's involved? How it's being discussed? Is it taking place in a respectful manner? Are people truly seeking understanding about something? Or are they engaging in conflict just to be sensationalist or, stir the pot? And those are decisions that we have to make in the moment. Do you have any other thoughts or questions?
Trying to give ample time because last time we got a question right at the end when we were ending the webinar, and I want to make sure that everyone gets their thoughts in.
I agree. I was sorry that we missed that question. You're welcome.
As we maybe wait for some things to come in, I do want to say thank you for joining us tonight for this. And we will be back. Dr. Bedford will be back next Monday, the 27th, to discuss critical thinking and media literacy. We are heading into election years, so that's a great topic. And we are going to be following up with some emails, with some resources, very similar to what we did last time, and with the recording, just in case you had to step away or anything like that.
We do have a question. In your opinion, should microaggressions be addressed head on, or should they be as subtle as the attempts? That is a good question, and I think again it's situational. Microaggressions take place in all sorts of settings, and under different as a result of different occasions. And sometimes something will happen, and then the next day you have all of these things being said, and microaggressions can manifest in different ways. And when people are being openly hostile like that, it can be very, very difficult to navigate and figure out, how do I respond to this? Because you don't want to spend your lifetime responding to things. You want to live in peace. You want to live in comfort, and you don't want things constantly, interfering with that peace. And so I think it's situational. And if someone is saying something and you know that it's being directed at you or someone that you care about, you have to decide in that moment, do I act upon this and respond and kind of explain to this person, look, I know what you're doing and I don't find this to be appropriate. The only thing that I would say is, don't allow yourself to fall down into that person's space. Don't get sucked into that vortex of negativity and nastiness. Even if you decide that you are going to respond, don't become aggressive yourself. Show them how they should respond or engage with people in discourse by being civilized yourself. That's the only thing that I can offer. Yes, I've enjoyed our session today, and I really enjoy your feedback and participation, because I stand to learn. I don't know everything. And, people look at people with PhDs as though they have expertise in these areas, and we're constantly learning. A PhD, I always tell people, a PhD means that you have been granted the designation that you are willing to learn. And outside of that, you have a very small territory, very small coverage. I will never, the day I defended my dissertation many years ago at this point, I felt like the most ignorant person on the planet, because I realized there are so many books I'm never going to touch, so many things I'm never going to have the opportunity to read. And so I learn a lot from my students every day. You would be amazed what these kids can teach you. And I certainly learn from you all. So thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Okay, do we feel like we're feeling good at this point? Should we call it a night?
Well, I think that we can, and I have no problem, picking up next week. If you have questions that we miss, you can certainly send them to Britain and I can follow up, because these are building upon each other. None of these subjects stands in isolation from one another. They're all related.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Dr. Bedford. Always such good stuff. I got two very great quotes from you tonight. The potential for learning is immense, and don't discount the importance of storytelling. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to next week, and I hope everyone can make it.
I am too. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.